Serious here.
Yeah. All right. Recording's on. So here we go, guys.
Hey, caffeine level coming up. Hands not yet shaking.
Not yet.
You have high resistance.
So do you have the slide picked out you want to start back in on?
Yeah, I do. I thought I'd just say, hi, everybody. Well, you can see the face. Yeah, okay. So there we are. All right, so let's begin with the screen there. That. We'll go to list mode. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, Matt, Bill. Thank you. Yeah. So hopefully chị ơi. I see. Sì.
Okay, Sam.
Yo, all right, so let's go. A few days ago, you may recall seeing this photo of a big pile of earthworm castings and one of my feet and a whole lot more earthworm castings. So did you find any thing that looked like it might have been coming out the rear end of an earthworm in your farms, your land, any place in the last?
I have a lot of strange soil. I have little beasts.
Little beasts.
Soil, you know, like gray, brown things, yeah. Yeah, and you have some that walk with white.
So like roly-polies?
Yes.
Roly-polies, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of those?
I have like, they small like this. Dyson total, thousands. How you call this small?
Oh, millipede?
Yeah.
Right.
Some millipedes?
Millipedes, yeah, they should be there.
I saw some ants, big ants, which I didn't like much because those big ants eat white ants. So I have to get rid of that. It's attacking my plant because it didn't get too much water. That's not such a good news with it.
So they eat white ants?
Yeah.
What is
White ants are termites, in other words.
Yeah, it's a big ant. And when you see it, you know that you have white termites in the neighborhood at the wood because they eat them.
So you're trying to get rid of the termites to kill the ants?
I want to get rid. I'm giving all the plant much more water, so the ants is getting out.
And some like the water.
They don't like the water. Yeah, but it's
okay.
All right. Okay, well, there's a lot of interesting things that ants do. So anyway, one of the things that I think it's important to, in this thinking about kind of little animals you've got, little critters. So here's this graph has a picture of a roly-poly, or there's a bunch of different names for those. But they are all small crustaceans. These are related to shrimps and crabs, but they live on the land. Oh, some live in the sea too, but it's all different ones. So what the point of this illustration is that the soil animals, these big ones, they actually have a big influence on what the soil microbial activity is. So you get an increased microbial activity with the activities of these things like roly-polies or millipedes or earthworms. So this is graph shows that after a few days, so the days are on the bottom, 5, 10, 15, 20, just after, right at the beginning of this experiment, it doesn't really make any difference, but then after about 5, 6 to 10 days, there's a big increase in microbial activity when there are the animals present. So, and that lasts for quite a long time. And so this is done in a laboratory. In the real world, the little animals would be moving around more and doing their thing for long periods of time. So this just shows that you can get a lot of activity. You promote the growth of these bacteria in the soil by having soil animals. So that's why I thought it would be interesting to have everyone go out and take a look. What did you find? And so someone found these roly-polies or isopods, is the technical name, or wood lice. But you know, these are usually eating only dead plant material. Although in our area in Iowa, we can have them sometimes eating very young plants, seedlings. But generally they are eating dead material. And it's that chewing up of the dead material that causes the bacterial activity to increase. Okay, so.
A question.
Yeah, question?
When you see like white spots in your food, what is that?
White spot? You mean like under the ground, on top of the ground?
In the ground.
Are they like threads, or are they just spots? Like how big are they?
They are small.
There's no threads on them?
The one in there?
No. But it is soft here.
Not like
It's moist, yeah.
But not like you're sprinkling water. Like.
Are they moving or they're?
They never move? They don't. I mean, they're not egg sacs. They don't hatch.
No. Well, I see one or we take Yeah.
Yeah, it does sound
that
like
is
fungus,
that,
but
yeah.
without seeing it.
That is, I think it did.
There is fungi active here. Barbolina's farm, we definitely found examples when we started to up some soil underneath some trees that hadn't been farmed or disturbed for a while. Even along the side of the road, I've seen mushrooms popping up out of the ground. Not even necessarily after a rain. I just saw them coming up out of the ground.
Because this you don't have conversation.
Maybe greater condensation during this time is helping these things happen.
Yeah. Okay. Onwards. We get to the end of that question, okay?
Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of funny little white things you can see sometimes. There can be some kinds of very small insects that might be on the root of a plant, but then you dig up and what you see is that thing has now fallen off of the root, and so you just see it as a little white thing, but it would, it might underneath white be having eggs, or sorry, no, not eggs, but legs. It might be something alive. It might be a little fungal body of some sort, even without much in the way of threads. So yeah, it's hard to tell with a lot of these things unless you can get a good look at it. Okay, so let's move
Got another
on.
question here, Sam.
Okay.
Does the amount makes a difference? Because I got like hundreds of roly-polies at a square meter. Really?
So can having a high population of roly-polies have a difference of effect?
Yeah, that is a question. I mean, if they've got plenty of other things to chew on, you know, dead material, mulches, dead leaves, that kind of stuff. They'll probably focus on that. They mainly consume dead material, and they digest the bacteria and fungi that are in the dead material, and they chew it all up, and that increases the total number of particles of dead material and makes them much, much smaller. And that means that bacteria can reach those deeper into the dead stuff. So it's fragmentation is a really important process that they do. The question then is, are they getting onto young plants? Because it would only be on young plants that they might be a pest.
Yeah, it's mostly in leaf litter, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah, if they're under the leaf litter, that's okay, because they're fragmenting, they're chewing it up, they're going to break it down, and they have, they're part of this whole cycle of decomposition. So that's what this current slide is showing, that you've got the animals, they are chewing up what we perceive as what they are eating, but they normally are not really eating that. You know, the dead leaf is to the roly-poly is just, it's like a place where its food is, but it isn't the food. The food is the bacteria and fungi that are living on the dead leaf. So the roly-poly can digest those, and as it does so, it breaks up the material, and then bacteria and fungi recolonize that material after it comes out of the roly-polies as their poop, and it continues to undergo decomposition. And that's because most animals don't have the ability to digest plant fibers, the cellulose, the leaf material or wood. And so they digest the digesters. So that's one of the reasons we sometimes call it like the external digestion system. You've got the internal and the external. The external goes on outside, then they eat, and then they digest what they ate, but only the easy stuff like the bacteria. And then they defecate it, and it becomes a new food for other bacteria or fungus in that system. So that's why these guys are so important. So this is a crazy looking diagram, but so decomposition of dead material, you start off with the dead material, and then you've got fragmentation, and then you've got fragmented dead material, and so on. And then you've got decomposers. So like this is where your roly-poly is here, it fragments and eats, and then it becomes part of that roly-poly, right? And then it may die, and it will also decompose by action of bacteria and enzymes and so on. So on and on, this whole system is kind of a cycle or a spiral where the animals eat, they grind it up, they defecate, something else comes along, and so bacteria and fungi are working on that material. Some other little animal comes along and eats that. So, and then something smaller eats, and something smaller eats, and so on. So you have this whole process. Things like earthworms, millipedes, termites, they are ingesting and breaking things down, and you end up with smaller animals like nematodes and mites and other small animals in the soil that eat the leftovers, the defecations of the bigger animals. And so then this just keeps going around and around, and then it finally ends up as this category we call H, or humus. So here in the red boxes. So you get some humus formed, and then you go, it says, to the next level over here on the right. That means it's coming right back around in, but at a tinier scale, smaller pieces and smaller everything, but the same basic process. So That's what the soil organic matter, that's how soil organic matter comes into existence. It's through this combined activity of the animals and bacteria and fungi. And these are what we call detritivore food webs. So detritus, that's the dead material, the leaves, the stems, the fallen fruits and pieces of wood, stuff like that. You transform it stepwise by fragmentation, ingestion, defecation, further decay by bacteria, then ingestion again, and around and around. So that was the end of that particular bit. And then I have another one to start next. Now, should we have any question about that?
No, I think you wowed them, Sam.
Okay, everybody's asleep or just in stunned silence?
Yeah, they can't handle
Okay.
it.
All right, we'll proceed. So now it's going to kind of take from that point where we're getting, some understanding of how organic matter on the surface of the soil or within the soil gets transformed from what we can see as a dead plant part, and then it becomes so intimately part of the soil that we really don't see it anymore. It affects the color of the soil and the handling characteristics of the soil, but we don't really see any pieces anymore. It's down to like molecule level practically. So what we're going then is what we've talked about: who is making soil organic matter, where it comes from, and then how does it get to be stored in the soil, and what difference does that make to the soil from an agricultural perspective. And one of the important parts of this is what we call soil aggregation. Anybody remember what's soil made out of? It's mineral grains and it's organic matter and living things, right? So like when you pick up some soil in your place, does it break apart into just a powder? Or does something else happen?
It's cold.
It depends on where they're at. So, come on.
It has a composure.
Yeah, it has a form.
So it sticks together.
It's not fall
It sticks
apart.
together or it breaks into certain pieces.
It depends upon it.
So
So
it
it has,
sticks together, maybe breaks apart different ways.
but there's like you could say there's like crumbs of soil. So you do your jar test, right? And that's to separate the different fractions of the soil mineral material.
There is some like stone.
Yeah. So here it's sand, silt, and clay. Sam, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. Here's a jar test I started today, about 8 hours ago. I don't know. You see any of those
Okay.
layers?
Right, yeah. I don't think you
So-
want to use that bottle again for your drinking water, but
Yeah. So I tried to follow the video guidelines on 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 day. But looking at it, you can kind of see different layers other than, I don't know, it's hard to point at here. And we'll look at it again on,
yeah, I would, if you don't mind, and you can leave them for several days, and you'll see that, the clay, the water will be muddy it could be for weeks even. But I've had jars where you just let it sit, and then after about 10 days or so, finally the water at the top clears.
What happens if it doesn't have that much layers? What would it be? Let's say.
so this is just showing the 3 different kinds of particles in the soil. So there should be 3 general layers. So in every jar test,
Should be.
you're going to have a different amount of layers. Some will have mostly sand, some will have an even distribution, some might have mostly clay. I mean, it depends. So your examples, Aisha, will be great because you can see their different colors now. So over the next several days, we'll let them settle and we'll watch.
Yeah. So in general, when you shake up the soil, did you put anything in it, just water and soil, or anything else like salt?
Just water and soil. I just went out to the government plot and went to the raised beds and took some handfuls and shoved them in.
Okay. And then you shake.
Yep.
So when you do this to really, really get a thorough analysis, you would you could just use table salt. That'll work. Or seawater. That'll work too. Or something else. But those are the simple ones. And really let her rip. Just shake it, shake it, shake it. Because some of the soil particles will be stuck to other soil particles. And so when you're doing the jar test just this simple way with water, you're going to get differences based on not just the soil particle sizes, the sand, silt, and clay, but also how much aggregation there is even after you have been shaking it in the water. So this is what aggregation is about. And aggregation is a good thing. Everybody likes aggregation. The only person who doesn't like aggregation is the woman making clay pots. You know, that's not good. To make a pottery clay, you need to destroy all of the aggregation in that clay, so that it's smooth, not lumpy, no little fine crumbly part in it. It's what you call puddling the clay. But that's when you have only clay or nearly pure clay, and you want it disaggregated so that there is no internal structure, just the clay particles and water. Okay, so aggregation then. You guys could even try this as an experiment. Use salt water in one jar and just regular tap water in another jar, and shake it up, two separate jars from the same soil sample, and see if you get anything different.
Yeah, I'll do that with the government farm soil.
Right, yeah, that'll be easy to do. Some of the things that people use as water softeners for the washing machines for clothes will also have the same effect. But table salt is easy, it's cheap, you can get it anywhere. So.
How we meant.
Liquid soap? Really?
But no,
Apparently somebody found a video using dishwashing liquid.
Okay, that might also break things up. But yeah, salts definitely do it. But old like water softener, Calgon, there's a product in the U.S., but there's other things like it. But any kind of salt will typically help break the soil particle from being stuck together.
All right.
So you have to add the salt with the dirt.
Yeah, salt, soil, and water.
Okay.
Shake it all together.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Let's say I take a sample of a dirt, and then I have sand. I have all the layers, but then I find that that dirt is poor because plants don't grow there. They grow better in another soil. So how am I gonna fix that dirt if it has all the layers?
Well, that's a complex question because having sand, silt, and clay in your soil doesn't necessarily determine how well a plant's going to grow. It can give you some introduction to it, but organic matter, the life of the soil, how you treated it, you know, how well it formed the aggregates. You know, this just tells us a ballpark of what the soil is like. This is not exact.
Yeah.
It is a loose tool.
It's nice to have a soil that has some sand, some silt, some clay. You can look at the. Did you guys see the what's called the soil texture triangle ever?
Yes, yeah, we looked at that.
Okay. Yeah, right. So you can know that, you know from your own experience that if you're just plain sand, is the water runs right through it. It's very difficult for plants to grow. But if it's, you know, very high clay, means it's also very difficult not only for plants but also for humans to do the work in the soil. And so that's why we do this jar test, just to get an idea, you know, what's there. So probably have some sand particles and some clay and some silt, and so that's nice. You got the 3 layers. That means it's not all one thing, or, you know, one of them's missing. But that's just sort of for physical convenience, you know, in the qualities of the soil. So aggregation, you know, this is where, even though if you have a lot of small particles like the silt and clay, you don't just have silt and clay particles in the soil all by themselves. They're stuck together into complex little crumbs of different sizes. So this illustration shows if you go from the left to the right, the magnification increases. So you can see on the left in white there's this blob, this thing, which shows that it's called a macro aggregate. And 3 millimeters, okay, so this thing is like 9 to maybe 9 by 10 millimeters. It can be quite large. Could be smaller too. But it would, you know, it's a macro aggregate. It means we can easily see that. When you break up soil gently by hand, it'll break into little pieces that could be on the order of this size. And that's what, you know, is a macro aggregate. It's a visible aggregate. And below the name macro aggregate, there's what causes macro aggregates to hold together. And there's 2 main things: plant roots and the fungal threads, or hyphae. So these threads of fungus act like little strings that hold these macro aggregates together. But now we move one illustration over, and it's a micro aggregate. So a macro aggregate is made out of many micro aggregates. It could be 20, 30, 100 micro aggregates to make up one macro. And you can see the magnification, or the scale. This is now 3/10 of a millimeter or less, you know, somewhere in that neighborhood. So it's a 1/10 the size even of a macro aggregate. And again, it's the roots, it's the fungus threads, and now another thing is important, which is polysaccharides. So that's a fancy name for things like starches and complex carbohydrates. You know, they say you should eat complex carbohydrates. Okay, well, your soil also contains complex carbohydrates, and those are helping to kind of glue the particle together to make a micro aggregate. Then we're going to move over one more, and it's going to be even smaller, a sub-micro. So this is below, this is even smaller than a micro aggregate. And you see that it's individual soil mineral grains. That's what those little grayish things are in there. And then plant and microbial debris. So that could be bits of organic matter, remains of roots, remains of fungal threads. And then some of the stuff is coated with clay. So even though we're looking at this as a, much smaller than a millimeter, it's still not as small as clay. Clay is very, very tiny. So silt particles or sand particles we could see at this scale, and they may have the remains of bacteria on them. They may have actual living bacteria on them, and they may also have clay particles stuck to them. So that's what makes up a microaggregate. And what you've seen up to this point is that every step of how an aggregate is built is based on organic matter, right? Roots, fungus, more roots, more fungus, complex carbohydrates, microbes, microbial debris, those sort of dead remains of bacteria, and plant organic matter, also maybe living or dead. Then we go down one more size scale, and you can have clay particles, dead bits of microbes, dead fungal remains, and then this thing's called clay humus domains. So clay particles are super small, and you can do did you all do the sort of rub it between your fingers test on soil samples? Get it wet, rub it?
No, we haven't.
You should try that, especially with different types of soils. Some that appear to be maybe that have a little bit more sandy particles in them, where you can see individual soil particle grains. You can rub those between your fingers and it will feel really gritty. But maybe there's another soil someplace where you don't have that quite as much and the soil feels smoother. Or you can find if anyone knows where there's a much more high clay content, or if there's any place on the island known for having clay, you could get some of that, rub it between your fingers, and you will feel that it's smooth. And when it's this, you have to get it wet. You rub it between your fingers, it feels smooth, slippery almost, and no gritty feeling. If there's even a finest little gritty feeling, that means there's silt in it, which is good. But clay particles are super tiny, and they are actually super tiny crystals. And different kinds of clay have very different properties, but we don't need to go into that. So on the primary particles on the far right, a primary particle would be a single grain of silt, a single grain of sand, but on this scale, they would be more like microaggregate size or macroaggregate size is a sand grain. So when we're talking primary particles like silt and clay, those are things that we would need a microscope to see. Clay we may not even be able to see easily with a microscope. And in between all of these particles, there are empty spaces. In between micro or submicro aggregates, there are spaces. And between micro aggregates, there's also spaces. So there's all of this space on the inside is where the water and air are stored. And it's where the soil animals that are small ones anyway, the really small ones that we can't easily see, they live in those water films and air spaces. And the bacteria live on water films on the particles. And the fungi grow in contact with those water films. And all of these spaces inside the soil, we can't see those easily, but they are there. And they are maintained by all of this activity of living things. So when you have good soil aggregation, your soil will not get dense and difficult to work. the roots of your plants will be able to penetrate into the soil easily and grow well. So that is number one reason why organic matter in soil is so important. Even soils that are what we call heavy soils, high in clay, those can become lighter in a way, easier to handle with the addition of organic matter and time, because it takes time for the soil organisms to process it, but they will. Oops. So what's going on with organic matter? It's at every level of this whole process, except at the very, very finest level. So at the bottom of the screen, it says clay platelets and cementing agents. Well, some of the cementing agents themselves are from the remains of bacteria, or they're some part of organic matter. And then you go up and you can see more. There's this brown stuff and remains of plants, and now you can start seeing up here hyphae, the fungal threads, bacteria, and then farther up more roots and hyphae and soil particles, and so then we get up to the macro aggregate scale. So the two realms here, one which has the purple bars and the other which has the blue, one says it's indirectly dependent on management. So that's where you come in. And then the upper part is directly dependent on management. So macro aggregation, this property of soil, which makes it easy to work with, is dependent on the way that the soil is treated. What's in the soil? How do you work with it? All of those things. How much organic matter is there? Are there a good balance of soil life? You know, several different kinds of soil animals living in it, and so forth. Those would be improving your macro aggregation. The other part, the micro aggregation, some of that does depend, but it depends on it a little bit less directly. So there'll be kind of like you could say a trickling down of organic matter into these deeper, finer levels of, very, very tiny things. 2 microns, a millionth of a meter. A human hair is much, much bigger than a micron. I'm not sure how big, but it's a lot bigger than this. So some of these features of micro aggregation down at the very bottom of the chart here, level E, these things are pretty much inherently properties of the soil particles and clay. There's almost nothing you can do that will destroy that. But everything else going up towards macro aggregation, that will be affected by your cultural practices and crop rotations and cover cropping and all the kinds of things that you will be implementing to improve your soil. Okay, any question about that? All right.
Nope.
Nope. Okay. So this is just a little bit of details about the agents that act in soil, the different kinds of things that help hold aggregates together. So you've got transient ones, the complex carbohydrates, the polysaccharides. Those are easily degraded by bacteria for energy sources and easily digested by a lot of little animals. So they have a short life. They are coming and going all the time. And then temporary, so roots and fungal hyphae, these are also temporary. Plants grow, plants die. Their roots grow, roots die. Fungi grow and fungi die. So these are why we say they are transient. But the dead material they leave behind may last longer. Then you have eventually, when organic matter is really finely processed and becomes humus, then it's what we call persistent and resistant components. So these are kinds of organic molecules that are very hard for fungi and bacteria to break down. So they remain in the soil and then they become associated with clay. And when I say strongly attached, well, it's strongly attached to the clay particles primarily, or silt less so, but clay mainly. Clay is really important. Sometimes people don't like clay in their soil, but clay really is an essential part of soil because it holds organic matter molecules, it holds nutrients, it's very useful for soil fertility and soil structure. However, a pure or very, very high percentage clay, like above 50, 60, 70%, that becomes very difficult farming. Okay. So coming back to this, it's just another view. A lot of different soil scientists have studied this. And so we've got this, another kind of cartoon version of it with a root, and then micro aggregates, which are made out of organic matter, very tiny aggregates that are the size of silt grains, even though they're made out of clay. Then you've got clay microstructures where lots of clay particles have bonded together. And then you've got organic matter in the process of decomposition. And then you've got these green threads are representing the fungus. But then also there's a lot of pore space. So in each aggregate and between the aggregates and another aggregate, there's space. And so that's why we can say that a well-structured soil, which means it has a lot of aggregation, it could be 30, 40, 50% airspace or water space. So soil, even though we think of it as a solid, it's actually sort of a semi. There's a lot of air in there. Okay, so to review this then, roots and hyphae, the fungi, they stabilize macro aggregates, and this can resist water breaking them up. So even mild shaking might not break up a macro aggregate that's got a lot of root and fungus material holding it together. And so this is where soil management comes in. You can actually increase the level of macro aggregation. And then how much plant rooting you've got in there, and how much organic matter, the carbon material in the soil, gets oxidized. Soil tillage tends to expose soil organic matter to levels of oxidation or loss that it wouldn't normally experience just as a soil undisturbed. So we do have to till, we do have to move the soil, and when we do, we tends to release a little bit of organic matter, but we can always put it back. That too much of conventional agriculture just takes it out, just does things that remove organic matter and doesn't replace it as fast. And then it declines and then reaches a level that's more stable. And that's when you've eliminated most of the organic matter that's in the management category, and you're down to the last little bits that are a bit beyond the reach of management. So those are the last resort. That's the last thing that's holding on to, to keeping the soil particles aggregated at the micro aggregation level. So what happens to a soil that is abused is it loses macro aggregation. It becomes more difficult to work. You spend more energy working on it, and it doesn't conduct air and water as effectively. And therefore, it's an inferior environment for plants to grow. Okay. Now that fine scale aggregation is very stable. So this is a quote from two of the founding scientists on this. The water stability of microaggregates depends on persistent organic binding agents and is a characteristic of soil independent of management. So that means to know how much microaggregation and sub-microaggregation there is, that's what kind of clay minerals you have and what kind of organic binding agents. So the old, very, very broken down organic matter that hold those things together. And clay minerals stick to each other as well. So this is something that in your jar test, you're never going to break that up unless you use something like salt. So when we do a full soil texture analysis, we typically use a kind of salt, not necessarily table salt, and a blender. And we soak the soil for a few hours, and then in water, and then we mix it in, we put it into the blender, add more water, and run it for 5 minutes. And that is enough to break apart even the clay particles. Individual clay particles get separated from each other. Ordinarily, though, that is almost never happens. So it's an inherent property of the soil. So that's good. It's your backup, but you don't want to get to that point. Always want to have good macro aggregation. So you've got the properties of your soil that come from the formation of that soil over the thousands of years. Then that gives you micro aggregation. And then the biological processes, the life in the soil starts building those into macro aggregates. And then that is something that comes and goes depending on what happens to the soil. All right. So there's a lot of different organic matter types. There's what's called stabilized, like humus, and those are the ones that are the persistent, the long-lasting binding agents for macro aggregates. And then you have the threads, we could say, the fungus threads and the roots. And the small roots, the very finest of the roots. Big roots don't do that much. If it's a root as big as your thumb or finger, that doesn't have a role in macro aggregation. It's the fine roots that do that. And so you might find some earthworm casts someplace. And if you have and look at them, you realize that they don't really look that much, they look kind of like soil, same color, but if you consider their internal structure, what does it look like? Have you had that good luck to find some earthworm cast someplace?
Yes, no.
Yeah, some.
Remember what to do? It looked like poop, but then from birds.
It's a little here.
Yeah, it just looked like a little heap of poop, but made out of earth.
Right, yeah, a little earth-colored poop emoji with no eyes on it, right?
Yeah.
Nailed it, Sam.
Yeah. Okay. So it's, if you were to pick up some of those pieces of that and break them open carefully, you would see they're pretty uniform inside, all kind of like a smooth paste that is hardened up as it dries. That's because the earthworm was grinding it up. You know, it was acting a little bit like the jar test in there, but didn't separate. It sort of mixes it all up, mashes it all up, breaks up the macro aggregates, and might even get it down into very small micro aggregates. But that's where those short-lived things like plant roots and fungus hyphae, they go away on the way through an earthworm. They may bounce back later, but earthworm castings tend to be sort of squished together soil. But they also become such hot spots of growth afterwards that they become a kind of source of macro aggregation. Now, I mentioned this as real world earthworms, not composting, because compost earthworm casts are made out of 100% organic material. So in this case, we're talking about earthworms that you find living in the soil. Like Chris sent me some photos from last time, and those are definitely earthworms living in the soil. And one of them, I think, was pooping on the when it was found. So it's a wet, pasty soil. Okay, so it doesn't look like this. It's got less internal structure, more just a uniform, smooth paste.
Plus the earthworm cast has also a lot of minerals.
Do worm castings also have high mineral content?
They will have a higher availability than before it went into the worm. So worms, they don't just eat everything they encounter. They choose to eat certain parts of the soil and not others. So there is some slight tendency for the soil that they consume to be higher in organic matter than the soil as a total. So if you just say took a 100 grams of soil and ground it to a fine powder and then take out 1 gram and do the test to find out what amount of organic matter is there, okay, you'll get a number. But if you let an earthworm pick through the soil before you grind it up, it might choose the most organic matter rich things in the soil. So there's a little bit of a problem there because worms are selective, but for the most part, they tend to favor consuming organic matter and soil along with it. And they're not seeking higher minerals or even higher nitrogen, but they will get higher organic matter. And then as a result of the activity of the bacteria that wake up when the earthworm eats that stuff, then you get higher availability of nutrients, all kinds, micronutrients and the big ones, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. Those availabilities will go up from passing through an earthworm.
Because I remember when I used to crack open the earthworm casting and I would look at it in the sunlight, I would see a lot of reflections, like gases or small pieces of something that reflects the light. So I thought
Probably the microaggregates you're saying.
Or a little bit of water or something in there.
no, but these ones are dry.
Dry. Okay, well,
Sam, when an earthworm's eating the soil, is it concerned? I've heard before that it's mainly eating the life in the soil. It's not actually eating the soil itself. It's eating things that are eating the soil. Is that accurate?
Pretty close. Yeah, they're consuming, certain kinds of earthworms, like the larger one that you showed a photo of. You sent a photo to me last time. That one was going to be consuming soil mainly and digesting out stuff in the soil. But even there, it's probably going to look for higher organic matter portions of the soil.
Is that because it can digest the organic matter, or is that because organic matter is more rich in soil life?
Well, they, like a lot of these things, they digest the soil life. The bacteria, stuff like that. They can digest that.
So by having a lot of life, we encourage more life, basically.
Yeah, the having a higher amount of organic material in the soil feeds the tiny things in the soil, which in turn feed the larger things. So nematodes, mites, earthworms, various others, the roly-polies, they all just munch on bacteria and fungi that are themselves growing on the dead organic matter. Go ahead.
That would mean that when it eats, digests things that it wants to digest, the life, it poops it out, and it would eat that thing again, because that is again
some others and
It
they
could.
eat them.
It could. Yeah, because Sam's been saying, like, it's inoculated with some life coming out of its back end, but then the way that it's processed, the materials, other life wakes up because the conditions are now correct for it. So yeah, it could definitely eat its own poop if it wanted to, just because it was so rich in life.
Yeah. Now, typically, when an earthworm poops, then a whole new community of bacteria starts to grow on it, and after a while, that other animals may start come and eat that earthworm poop, and those will typically be smaller. And then they poop and something else eats that poop. So it's just this over and over again. But as this process goes, it's still in the soil, it's still part of the soil, and another earthworm may come cruising through and eat the whole business all over again. But they're not going to like turn around and eat it again. Now, I just had my daughter's puppy for a week, and he's eating it, He dumps, he turns around, and if you're not fast enough, it goes right back in. Or, so we figured, man, if he's going to grow or not be hungry, he's got to eat something that he hasn't already eaten. So, yeah, and even the worms that live in compost, they don't like to eat their own poop. They want to eat something else. So.
If you split an earthworm into, we have 2 worms now.
So if you split an earthworm in 2, do they both grow into new worms?
No, you only get one.
So it's what, the end with the head can survive?
The end with the head can survive, yeah. And it depends on the worm. Some worms can't regenerate. They will just, both parts will die, but many of them will regrow. They'll grow themselves a new tail end, and then they can start recovering their body length.
Gotcha.
Scientist.
It's a common question.
Other questions?
Scientific research.
Break?
Break time?
Let's take a short coffee break here, Sam.
All right. See you in a bit. Hang on a second. I'm writing down some more page numbers.
There you You go a little higher, we could see them.
Ah,
And like I said, I didn't get the chance to assign those last ones, so if you want to write those down too.
right. Yeah. Um, okay, nice. And then I think the other pages were like the low, mid 50s.
I can try to find them in my email if you'd like.
Yeah, well, let's just start with 49 to 59.
We really can't see those numbers.
All right, I'll make sure that you can, one way or the other here. I got too many wires.
And you should write down these page numbers, or yeah, I can send out an app here. Hold it right there, Sam. I'll send an app out right now. Hold on.
49, 59. It's from the same book from last.
Yeah, so this is from the book that's in your student shared folder. All right, we got them, Sam.
Got him. Okay. So other than looking at that little corner window, are you also seeing this, one of my worm cast does not look like this slide?
Let's see. Yeah, Wormcast does not look like this. Yep, that's it.
Okay. All right. So we're moving along to from what it doesn't look like. So this is just a finer view of this. So you know that when, hang on a second, I got a door that I need to close.
Chris, can you move the screen a little bit down?
So this is a very sort of fine scale perspective on how soil gets created, related to what we've been going over so far. So backing up a few steps, we know that rocks break down, they are physically changed, they get broken up into little pieces, they get chemically changed so that they may get softer, some minerals may get removed from them by water, and so on. And then you end up with fine particles and modification that can create clays and stuff. Anyway, so we know that soil contains a mineral component that is basically rocks that have been modified. Just simply grinding up rocks doesn't make soil. It does take some changes. And this slide is showing you some of what happens in that process. So we used to think that rock would get ground up, get broken up into little pieces, and then there would be organic molecules on the surfaces of those mineral grains doing something. They'd be sitting there making the tiny grains function like soils. Now, this was originally done in French, so I've put over translation, so you may see some things in there that look a little strange, like French phrases, but Anyway, so on the left is the old way of thinking. On the right is the newer, that you have organic compounds are forming layers, and they actually penetrate into the mineral material a little bit. So minerals are in stages of modification in the soil, and now we are at the nanometer scale, so the billionth of a meter, very, very fine levels. This is, again, something you would never see, but with a much, much greater magnification that can be, you can actually observe this. So you get modified mineral layers on the surface of a mineral grain, and then organic matter is, and complexes of organic matters start getting stuck to this, and that helps to slowly break apart the rock bit by bit, and gradually the modified layer, that's which is in light blue, penetrates deeper and deeper into the stone. So this is, you know, tens or hundreds of years process, maybe thousands of years process. But it's all based on what's happening with organic matter, and therefore it takes us right back to the big scale that we can work with organic matter in the soil, soil animals, soil life, creating this organo-mineral complexes that develop and go deeper and deeper into the rock. So especially in susceptible, like rocks that are not very strong, not very resistant, like limestone, this process is fast. In the core sections of the island where it's a different kind of rock, the old volcanic rock, this process is much slower, but it still goes on. And so this is how life is a soil forming force at the finest level, at the tiniest scale, as also it is at the larger scale that we can see. Okay. So, microbial products, fine levels of aggregation are based on small things, and large scales of aggregation are based on larger things. So this is, again, this whole story is about the roles of organic matter making soil function well. Now, earthworm casts, or the aggregation effect of earthworms, is from a couple of different processes, that they physically smash soil particles, or in this case, usually it's microaggregates, together. And they can do this by burrowing and pushing against the soil, but they can also do it by eating the soil and grinding it all up together. And then the bacterial action takes over, and bacteria grow rapidly, and then they may die, and bacteria tend to be a little bit sticky and gluey feeling if you get a whole lot of them. And that gluing quality is capable of holding soil particles together. Then another thing that happens with earthworm cast is, because the nutrients are more available, roots and hyphae like to find earthworm castings. So roots will, if they encounter an earthworm cast, they'll start to grow into it, and fungus threads will also grow into it and grow on it, and they'll help hold it together. So that helps the macro aggregate scale. So you get the two things, the bacterial glue, which is micro, and the roots and fungal threads, which is a macro aggregation. And there's one final benefit or one final effect that we didn't really know about for a long time, but it's been pretty well verified now, that an earthworm cast can be fairly dense, and the air exchange to the center of that casting can be limited. And therefore, organic matter in the middle, so that's the OM, organic matter is protected by being in the middle of one of these earthworm castings. So there's two aspects. You know, an earthworm wants to digest organic matter out of the soil. It wants to get food out of the soil. And the only food in the soil is some kind of organic matter. It may be living, like bacteria. Nevertheless, it's organic matter. So you think, oh, you know, earthworms are just going to digest as much of the organic matter as they can, but they also promote growth of plants and also promote this protection of whatever organic is left in the middle of a cast is protected from oxidizing. So bacteria, most of them in the soil, are dependent on oxygen. There are some that are not, and they may take up life in the middle of an earthworm cast. But the overall rate of breakdown of organic matter will go down when earthworm casts are big. So it depends on the kind of earthworm, but this can happen. So let's see. And then this is just kind of an overall view of earthworms. And that looks a little bit like the worm that Chris showed me, but I don't know if it is or not. And so you've got, this is an illustration from a publication about earthworms, soil animals, and charcoal, biochar. And this was in the Amazon basin region along rivers where the native people's activities created black soil in a land where it's mostly just yellow or orange. And it was the mixing in of the biochar that helped to create the darkness of the soil. So down there in the center bottom, it's what does the earthworm do? Selectively ingests soil particles and organic matter, including biochar, but mostly by accident probably. Then it has its own microbiome, its own kinds of bacteria that live inside an earthworm or that wake up when soil passes in. That's what we call the gut priming effect or the sleeping beauty effect. So you get this activity increase of different kinds of bacteria, and then digestion of microbes. That's how the earthworm actually makes a living. And then it creates some mineral weathering, like that slide I showed a couple of them ago, which had the blue chunks in it with some of the words in French. So that's mineral weathering. That's altering the size and the chemical makeup of soil mineral particles or small bits of stone. And then out comes, in the casts, nutrients that are made available, and then you get increased microbial activity in those casts and over many weeks, and some stable calcium carbonate that comes out of the earthworm as well. Okay, then on the right-hand side of the illustration, over by those two trees, but outside, you see a few different things. Mixing of surface litter and coarse organic matter into the topsoil. That's an earthworm function, but also other soil animals. Millipedes and roly-polies can do that. And that's just what we call bioturbation. So it's this stirring by animals that affects the mixing of the organic matter into the soil. It also affects that there are pores in the soil and affects aggregation, and then it tends to homogenize the soil profile. So it, where there may have been very distinct layers, instead it mixes vertically. So topsoil is mixed downwards and lower soil, subsoil is mixed upwards. So some other animals do this too. A lot of bigger ones like moles and burrowing animals, anything that burrows is going to be mixing. Ants and termites will do this too. So these are some of the main functions of these animals that manipulate organic matter. They're doing it for their own good, but it's something that helps us also. Okay. So sort of the practical part, what does this do? We would say that any agricultural practice that elevates soil organic matter has the potential to improve the handling characteristics of your soil. And mainly that's from improved aggregation. Does anyone have a kind of soil that's difficult to work with? It tends to form dense clods or otherwise becomes a problem. Anybody have that?
So it's hard.
I have a part that is hard.
So there's parts where it's hard to dig a hole, or
To dig a hole, very hard.
so it gets compact.
It's like a rock.
Anywhere where it like clods up, where like if it's wet and you work with it, it forms big clods. Did we get that, Marco? Yes. Like if you fill it, clay. Yeah, you probably have it. Your soil's darker, but I mean, a lot of water would kind of aggregates there, so clay would wash that way too.
And is that it's lighter, so it's almost like a rock. The rock is very soft.
So that's the difference in amount of organic matter. I would guess that you probably have similar amounts of sand, silt, clay in those two areas, but you have more organic matter that's gathered down at the bottom of the hill. That's why I would rather grow down there than try to carry all the organic matter up the hill.
That's really
Look up there. So it's, looking at the jar test that I have going so far, it's not as dramatically clay as I imagined it would be. It's actually sand. I mean, I knew it'd be a lot of sand, depending on where the cutoff. What's the cutoff size for sand particles, Sam?
Bottom end is maybe a like 1/10 of a millimeter or something. I'd have to look that up.
What's the top?
Oh, at some point you start saying that it's rocks. So coarse sand would be 5 millimeters or a centimeter, 10 millimeters. That would be pretty much small stones, so probably 5 millimeters or so.
Yeah, so somewhere, I mean, a lot of this is sand. Half of this soil is sand, you could say, or rocks, sand or rocks. And then, there's a layer that, maybe 20% you could say is silt potentially. And then depending on how the soil settles out, maybe another 10 or 20%, something like that is clay. So from a technical perspective, if all other things were equal, this should be well-drained soil. It should be pretty decent soil. But we don't see that. We see soil that holds water. We see water ponding on top of the soil a lot. So even though we have something that should behave with decent drainage, in theory, it doesn't act that way. So it's, if we added organic matter, that would help, space things out or bind them into aggregates a little bit better. We don't see a lot of aggregates in the soil that I've seen so far. We see like chunks of things, like rocks and pieces of clay, like pieces of sand. Like I don't see, like I can't like grab the soil and squeeze it and break it apart and it like forms aggregates. It's pieces. It doesn't bond in certain ways. So
Okay, so when it's dry, it's rock-like. You have to beat on it to break it up.
Yep.
And when it's wet, it mashes and doesn't fragment.
It doesn't bond. You can squeeze it and it still kind of acts like a sand.
Weird.
Yeah.
No, that's because of the temperature. If the soil is not covered, the organic material will burn. That's why.
Well, that's exactly the point. There's no organic material in this. Really. I mean, it's very low organic matter. Yet in places where the soil is covered, it's darker. There's more organic matter. You can start making. And Marco, what happens? I mean, you said you can make clods in your soil if you till it when it's wet. I mean, that's organic matter, helping the interaction.
Is that just on the yard?
And the LVD field. Yeah. This is from the raised beds.
At the very to the bed.
Yeah, from the beds itself.
But isn't that part filled up with the gas?
What?
That part is, I think, we filled it up at one point with
Stones.
so you just have to make it.
They did, then it looks like a hell of a lot of the soil I see around the island. It doesn't look that much different. A lot of
This is just like hills, pieces of it, they pick it up, crumble it, and then they sell it as.
So then that further kind of shows the point of there's just not much organic matter.
If you do, let's say, by doing better,
Sure, I get it.
you get real soil from.
Yeah. So, but you could also say that your soil has been tilled and beat up enough and worked over and over again that it maybe isn't so far off from that heavy soil because it's just been beat so many times over and over again.
This is like all you find any organic.
I
All
agree.
you find, all you find.
But
It's
this,
just
and,
pieces
but
of
this,
rock they break off the machine with excavator, they break it off and then
the soil seems pretty indicative of a lot of soil I see around, though. I don't think you can kind of convince me of that otherwise. Like, this is what I see a lot of places. Like this and actual dark soil that still has organic
on the
matter.
inside you see this. Go deeper into the valleys, you find
You see the
this type
topsoil.
of soil.
Yeah,
Because of the
it's all rushed from the hills down it. Yeah.
I have a question.
Hmm.
We got a question for you, Sam.
Okay, I'm
I know farmers that let certain parts of the land after they use it to sleep for a while before they use it again. Like can they instead of letting it sit there for a year or two to rest, can they just put manure and other things and then use it back again?
Maybe that or a cover crop and then let it rest. So yeah, a resting period or fallow period sometimes is practiced just to allow organic matter to recover under some kind of cover crop. It could be perennial or annual or short-lived. And in some of the dry climates, people will leave fallow. They won't even plant anything on it, but they'll leave it to grow nothing but to gather water again. But I don't know that would be the motivation in your area.
They do it a lot. You should know also. They let them I always get, yeah, let it sleep for a few years. That's what they do here. You see some plots just empty because
Yeah,
they
we were
use it
talking-
so much.
We were talking about this just a few minutes ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
So
a
you-
process of leaving it fallow. So it's a chance to let the ground recover. Yeah. So as you grow crops and you harvest them and take those fruits away, you're taking certain minerals, available minerals out of the soil.
Can I put it
So
back?
you could, so instead of leaving it fallow, you could probably add compost or
Stand
organic
up,
matter. But that means that you're trading time and the natural process for money and energy. Because then you either have to make the compost or buy the compost and apply it to your soil, which means you can keep farming it, but it's not the cost. Or if you develop a crop rotation where you account for a certain amount of time where the land will not be used, then you can get the same effects by planting something that, a cover crop, weeds even, whatever you want to do, leaving it for a year or two. It allows the biology to catch up, digest anything that you put onto the soil or work into it, build organic matter, potentially build up a reserve of available nutrients that when you work the soil or plant again, those nutrients are available either in a water soluble form or the biology in the soil has so prepared itself or recovered so much that when a plant requests nutrients, they are ready to respond. There's a high enough population that they can dissolve or change the form of the nutrients to give it to the plant. So it's you can cheat, so to speak, and add compost or fertilizers and not let the ground rest, but then you don't get the full recovery effect. You're trading money and energy for the natural process.
So for example, now you're doing this piece of land. Sure. Yeah. Do you already have an idea for how long you're gonna grow something and when you will let it rest, or you will let that depend on what you see?
Well, so far I've planted half of it to cover crops already because I've planted half of it to sorghum that I do not intend to harvest for a grain. I want to let it grow and feed the biology in the soil, put roots out, grow, basically just encourage life. I want to treat it with compost if I can, or at least compost teas, spray life into the soil around it on the leaves, start the cycling process going a little bit more, get more life going. And then at a certain point, either mow it and integrate it into the soil or cover it up and let it compost in place, or cut it off and use that green material for making compost that I'll apply to the beds that I am growing on with a cash crop. So in any of those instances, at least the roots of those plants are staying in the soil. We have living roots for a certain amount of time, which encourages the soil food web to be active, which means nutrients are cycling, which means life is happening, which means we have a healthy environment that can move nutrients around and help life grow. If I remove the stalks from above ground, that's taking some of the nutrients from that ground, but it's still leaving the roots in the ground, which will break down, decompose, compost on the spot, so to speak. That will add organic matter to the soil. Those roots, wherever they die, those are now pathways to the soil that water, air can pass through. Nutrients can now bind to that stuff that is broken down. And then the green tops can either be used for compost, like I said, or I'd like to use it for like a mulch. Instead of using the plastic mulches that I've been talking about, we can now use our cover crops as an organic mulch. And it's a way to let ground rest, but we focus resources at one time on a very small area. So think of the theory of the raised bed, of where you have this one very specific area of where we only apply our nutrients and water there. This is the only place we put it. So that's a physical way to do it, but this is also a way through time that we focus our resources as well. So half of our ground is relaxing, kicking back, resting, but then we'll focus the resources of half of our ground onto 3 growing beds. So we concentrate our resources into a very small area and help that small area get a boost up. And then, life begets life at a certain point. So if we create good conditions in the soil, add organic matter, then life will just keep going. And then that area can help feed other areas because it's more productive, it can produce more, we can get better crops out of it, or when we grow cover crops in that area, they'll grow bigger and stronger, and we can apply those cover crops to another area. Now we're feeding our own system. We're generating our fertility on farm. It's kind of like in the Centropic system when we went to that forest and took a bunch of leaves and brought it back and spread it out. Well, that forest can bear to lose a little bit of fertility because it's generated so much. The systems are moving. The systems are going. So what we're trying to do is harness, the larger half of the farm we're not going to use for the first few months, and then take that and focus it on a small area, and then we use our resources as effectively as possible.
Is there a resting time? Is there a resting time of the ground?
Like a recommended resting?
Yeah, a recommended resting time of the
Sam,
soil.
is there a recommended fallow time in the perspective of what you're talking about?
I think there should be. I don't know that that is really sort of translated into agroecological practice in organic farming. Generally, it seems to me like certain regions use fallow periods, but others don't. So the shifting agriculture patterns of the slightly more humid tropics than where you are, yeah, you can say that there is a recommended resting period, but it may be a decade or more. So you cut an area of forest, which isn't young, it's usually young forest, because your fathers may have cut that 20 years ago and grew crops there for 2 or 3 years and then moved and kept on rotating around and around. But in non-forested settings, or where people are not doing quite what's called shifting cultivation or slash and burn cultivation, fallow periods are maybe just on the order of 1 or 2 growing seasons. In recovering organic matter into cropland, perennial vegetation of some kind is the most effective. Grasses are very effective, perennial grasses. They will give you a very big increase in soil organic matter within a year or 2. They will continue for several years, but you can get a lot back in just 1 year. So that would be considered a kind of a fallow or a resting period, but something is growing there. There's just no export. You're not removing anything and taking it away from the farm. You might cut it, chop it, leave it, and then plants will grow up again through it. But there's no export. And the soil, all of the processes of soil organic matter making are going to happen there more abundantly because of the lack of soil disturbance. So one of the great things about mixed cultivations like a permaculture setting is you have both of those qualities going on, even when there's some extraction, some harvest, but you have perennial plants that devote much more energy to their roots than annual plants do. So, you know, beans and tomatoes and maize, those are annuals, and they don't make a big extensive root system because they are not going to be alive in, you know, another 5 or 6 months. But something else, you know, some vines or small trees or bushes, they must have a big root system, and they must invest more in the soil. They feed the soil more because the soil feeds them, and they're there to be growing for a long period. So I think it's a good question about what should be a rest period, and the answer to that is going to be really different in different places. So I guess for your situation, are there kinds of cover crops that can be grown just say on rainfall alone, no irrigation? And is it economic to take, say, maybe a quarter of your land out of economic production for a year, and then cycle it back in a year later or 2 years later? And what happens as a result of that? So evaluating crop rotations with fallow periods and without fallow periods is a many years long research project.
You could use custard. Rose custard. The custard plant. Castor. They grow here. They grow without irrigation. Custard. And they add a lot of nutrients to the soil.
Isn't it tough to manage though? I heard it was invasive.
I have some. I have a lot on my land. I used to chop them, but they said, people who saw them, they said no, they are fixing the soil where it is weak. I just cut them.
They can also harvest them.
To make the oil.
Use one.
Because they grow big.
Wandu is good. Wandu is good, but you know they still need water. They need water, but the custard plants can.
Castor don't need.
They really don't need water. I think they
need it, but they can survive
a certain amount of
It's true.
Yeah. Growing
Yeah.
around them for them. To
Otherwise, they
survive.
stay dry.
Need some
But
vegetation.
It's good.
It can be a good
They
cover
no
crop to
fruits.
use
So
to forest area.
Is it an annual or perennial?
It's a perennial. Because it grows naturally here.
That's good.
And it's been
it's
used
very
in
good.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, looking to native species, things that grow here in the natural environment would be a good place to start.
So biomass can be
big leaves.
Big leaves.
I mean, the
one
little experience I have with sorghum so far is that we barely watered it and it already grew. And it's just it's going.
It's like water.
But it's that similar idea of anything that can produce a lot of biomass, but without much effort is a good cover crop generally. And you can get more focused on different kinds of cover crops. We're just talking about cover crops that are basically drought tolerant and grow fast. That's the two kind of qualities we're focusing on.
But you cannot grow them without outside the rainy season. That's why I was thinking about this. They survive.
To survive. Yeah. I have a lot of them. To survive.
Cool.
No,
All right.
no. Leaf
And
plants.
you plant them from seed?
No, they just grow. They just fix your land.
No, you want to plant
You
them.
can
You can,
grow
yeah.
them from seeds. Because in
Are the seeds expensive?
The seeds,
you can harvest them.
I have, you can get.
How much you want to pay?
I have, you can get. Yeah.
What you want to pay?
I will not.
Expensive?
That's a very easy.
All right, Sam.
Yeah. You guys are working it all out. Yeah. So maybe, is there any nitrogen fixing stuff that could be thrown into a cover crop mix? That might help too. But just a suggestion. So I guess, you know, I've talked enough about earthworms. I don't want to hammer on earthworms too much. I know that they're there. They could be useful partners. And then there's a question, can there be too much organic matter? Maybe not a problem in your area, but it is something, you know, people sometimes go crazy thinking, oh, the more, the better. And you end up creating conditions that are not very, may not be very much natural. And I think there's a limit at which adding more probably isn't doing any good. It might not be doing any harm, but it's probably, you know, not going to do much good either. You know, what the natural system in a particular climate can grow, you know, how much mass of plant per square meter, that's probably the level of organic matter input that you would shoot for. For one, you don't have to gather more from some other place, although if you can get it as, you know, somebody doesn't want it, but you can get your hands on it, that's always a good thing. But you don't need to make a big, deep layer. But just, you know, the point is to increase organic carbon in the soil for the health of the soil and for the health of the planet. That's why we have this label of regenerative organic agriculture.
How can you go from earthworms?
There was
I think in one of his previous lectures, he said it's not acceptable. So you want to attract earthworms to your grounds, buying them or propagating them and spreading them around probably isn't going to get you there that fast. You could probably use your energy more effectively by creating conditions that an earthworm would like to be in, because earthworms are huge.
In buckets.
It will come also.
Yeah, as long as they are present in your area, generally, like, you know, even in your neighbor's land, they will find their way. And if you get lucky, you know, maybe there's a big rain someday and you go out on the street and there's earthworms crawling out of the ground every place, go get them and then take them to your place. But don't spend any money, and don't, you know, digging them up is a very difficult way. Unless there's someplace they are super abundant and you can get hundreds of them in an hour. But then, even then, that's, you know, you can have population of earthworms can be 100 per square meter. And if you think, oh, how many square meters do I have? No, you don't want to dig up that many earthworms. So if you don't have any in your place, yes, it's maybe worth finding some in the soil of a similar soil, and then get them and put them in. But again, the simplest way is when they come out on their own with a nice big rain or something. But then you just have to let, as Chris was repeating, let nature take its course. Give them the right conditions and they will multiply very quickly. And then you'll have the benefit.
You're going to grow in containers, maybe you're asking.
Yeah.
If there's no contact with the soil, then maybe you want to throw a handful in or a few in.
Right, that's a different situation.
You got another question here, Sam?
Okay.
So the question is, you know, how thick should the organic matter be in the soil? Do you mean like the darkness of the soil, or?
I mean, if I want to mulch, if I want to mulch the ground.
In tropics, 20%. Tropics.
So if you're going to mulch the ground, what's the minimum for maximum ranges of mulching a soil that would be beneficial?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, if it's to protect against water loss and moderate the soil temperature, you probably want at least 3-4 centimeters.
Permaculture, they say for dry.
Let him finish,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, I'm not sure if any more than that will do any good. But it also, you may find that it disappears very quickly. It may be getting broken down by soil animals or getting incorporated into the soil. That is something that you'll have to see by your own experience. With roly-polies and millipedes and earthworms all present, you will have some reduction of that mulch layer. So I think it's something you try and you keep an eye on it. But for starters, 5 centimeters should achieve the goals of retaining water and the soil temperature not going up too much. And sometimes there's unexpected consequences. Like the gentleman earlier mentioned that he has very large numbers of roly-polies in places, and you might not want to have huge numbers of those. They will maybe find something else tastes really good that you wish they would not eat. So.
But I would like to react to them, because if you put 5 centimeters mulch here, then the sun will burn it within a week. 5 centimeters is too little. And in the permaculture, they will say for our climate 20 centimeters to 40 centimeters at least to protect it against the drying out conditions we have here. A lot of wind, a lot of sunburn, and so the top layer of the mulch is burned down within 2-3 weeks. 10 centimeters lost with the sunburn only. So if you put 5 centimeters, you end up with nothing.
Uh-huh.
How much,
Okay,
how
well,
much, how much do the worms need? Like, how much space do the worms need to come up and do the work?
they will eat most of the earthworms that I know of that are likely to be present in your region primarily live in the soil, and they will come up under the mulch and take some organic matter directly from the mulch. But there are not going to be specialists on eating pure organic materials.
But the mulch doesn't obstruct them to do the work.
No, they will not be, they'll be okay as long as there's the primary limiting thing for earthworm activity is water. Second is temperature. And in your case, it would be too high temperature. But they will know what level of the soil to go to find their best conditions. Mulch should be overall very beneficial to earthworms as far as the two things. The soil will not become too hot, nor will it become too dry. So
I think his recommendation of 5 centimeters is not necessarily a long-term perspective. It's if you want to create the conditions for earthworms to come up in your soil, what's the minimum depth you need? And that will protect you. Even you said it's not going to go 2 or 3 weeks. So this isn't a putting 20, 30, 40 centimeters of mulch on, that'll last quite some time, but may disrupt other practices you're trying to do, like planting and seedlings. So it's just a thought of 5 centimeters holds moisture, keeps the soil cool, lets the worms come up close.
You have to keep in my situation, because I'm experimenting with this for 3 years now. In my situation, I have to have 20 centimeters, and that's after 3-4 months another 20 centimeters because it's gone already.
Right, 3 or 4 months.
Yes. That's because the other layer will be black, will be a centimeter or 2 black earth. So that will be out of the 20 centimeters, but the top layer is completely burned by the sun.
How much is the top layer burned?
I end up with 2 centimeters. So out of the 20 centimeters mulch, I end up with 2 centimeters. Then I have to add it again. So I'm waiting for years right now. That's why I got layers like this of black soil. On top of the diabasi was mentioned already.
I would guess a lot of that's been breaking down into soil rather than oxidizing with the sun. Probably most of it's been breaking down.
Yeah, let's hope.
Yeah, but that's the condition here. You know, if you go to the forest also, the forest teach you a lot. If the forest is very dense, then the leaves will stay. The sun will not burn it. If you go in a Wabi forest, the leaves are burning literally away. So there is no really mulch layer in the forest there. Because the sun is penetrating through the leaves and burning it.
Well, mulch layer is quite deep in the forest too.
Yes, and in the real forest, that's why you got a forest like when the paper mulch. That's a real forest. But if you go in the regenerating
behind the house,
Water
yeah,
forest.
Wabi forest, you see no leaves on the soil because they will burn.
Well, those leaves, and, wabi doesn't produce a lot of biomass. Also, yeah, those leaves are nothing. So it's the quality of the mulch too.
Not, I shouldn't say the Wabi forest, but where there are some other trees also too, like kind of mixed forest, but not as dense as the and there, yeah, and it
You
will
will
stay.
always find like out of topsoil that is beautiful.
Well, that's another layer of mulch in a way.
Yeah,
It's holding moisture, it's reducing temperature, it's allowing microbes.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting whole question about mulch, and not only. So I was just wanting to remind of one of what Thursday, the immobilization of nutrients by organic matter that has a high carbon to nitrogen content or high carbon to nutrient content. But apparently in this gentleman's experience, the mulch is going away rather quickly, so it must not be a great obstacle to decomposition, the lack of nutrient content in the mulch. But if there is, so say for example, something like wood chips or shredded wood, that should last relatively long, it being a high carbon material. On the other side, though, is if we're protecting soil for soil climate purposes, then you don't also want to be immobilizing valuable nutrients from the soil that go into the mulch and therefore remove from availability to the plants that are growing under the mulch. It doesn't sound like this is a problem yet, but it's something to be aware of. You know, that they say you can apply wood chip mulch, but just not to plants that have high demand of nutrients from the very surface of the soil, because then it might be getting subtracted. The nutrients may be going up into the contact layer with the soil of the mulch. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up and remind that there could be another side of the mulch story. And Chris mentioned the quality of the mulch, and that specifically that refers to how resistant to decomposition that mulch is.
Can you use also manure as mulch?
Could you use a manure as a mulch?
Yeah, except you might be losing. That should decay very rapidly. I mean, typically animal manures might be mixed in with bedding of material, but I don't think it would be as effective as something, say, as a mix of, say, chopped vegetation and manure. But it would certainly do the purpose of adding nutrients as well as organic matter.
It'll break down faster. Also,
Yeah, it'll
lose some of the value of the manure because it's on the surface rather than in the soil. Eventually, like you'll lose nitrogen to the air. Eventually.
right.
It would work. Yeah, it would work.
It would work.
Like Sam said, it would be, you could do better by mixing it with something else.
Combination
Yeah.
Question in the back.
Yeah.
Comment. If we talk about the California one, right? It's not supposed that we have to normally fight. There have another one, and that one goes go back down.
Yeah.
So they lay on a very low, very deep in the ground. That's why they appear during the rainy season. Right? So stay down, and when the conditions are okay for them, they come up to eat.
Right.
That's how we can find them. But those are not the California ones. Not in them. But if you want to have California ones, the problem with California ones is they only eat, and you can't have more than 10 centimeters of air above them. Yes, and the other thing of them is composted green material they need to be composted because they don't require more than 50 degrees temperature. It's supposed to kind of in them also.
Yeah.
So that's why the wind can be more than if your California ones, you can have wind more than 10 centimeters.
Right.
And that's supposed to be for about 1 month food for them.
Right.
Depends on the amount of California ones they have.
Makes sense. So the comment here, Sam, that the native variety of worm they have, it goes up and down in the soil profile, and only really is visible when it rains because they have to come up,
Right.
or drown. That versus the composting worm, where they kind of operate in the top surface layer, and if you put more than 10 centimeters of material on top of them, it can smother them. It's too much for them to manage. They'll die that way. So
Okay.
potentially managing, thinking of the variety of worms that we're dealing with here.
Yeah. So the interesting question there is, what kind of worm is that? And that would probably, I would need to actually see the individual, some earthworm specimens, and that's not totally practical, though good photos of a cleaned up earthworm, top side and underside. And if you don't know which side it is, you let the earthworm show you, and it will always have the bottom side down. But I often need to see that part. But yeah, I would have expected that any earthworms, say, living in unmanaged land or in forest on that island should be primarily soil dwellers, because there's not a long period of when the surface soil is wet, and any natural leaf mulch would be wet condition for them to eat. But there may be other things that are less dependent on water, like the roly-polies, millipedes. Those can work under drier conditions and eat the stuff.
I don't think, as I can hear from someone else, if we have our own worms here, why we have to import worms which cannot even stand the heat here? They will die if you put not much more. So I think we can see we have enough of those worms in the ground here.
Well,
that is good for our
I think
temperature.
the California worms, as you're terming them, are compost specific. They're purchased and brought in specifically to be used in a composting, like a worm compost system.
Yep,
They
that's true.
perform well in that setting. Maybe, Sam, you could probably comment a lot better than I could on that.
Yeah, so that one, so in Brazil, it's known as the red worm of California. It's actually from Central Europe. These things get around and people give them names. But they are typically a kind of a reddish brown or like burgundy color on the top. They may be a little more red on the front end than in the tail. They grow fast. They eat pure organic matter. So if you were to use manure as a food for them, that would work. But it has to not any manure, but something like horse manure, goat or cow or something like that. And it has to be made a little bit lighter with the addition of fibrous organic matter. So those work in composting, and they make a great compost that is a really good additive to soil and to make teas. It makes an excellent plant-stimulating tea. But they will not survive under soil conditions. They would only, in a natural setting in a farm, something that might naturally occur on a farm might be a pile of mulch materials or scraps or trimmings from plants or some animal manures thrown into a heap. They could live in that, but they wouldn't live in the soil. And they do require steady moisture, steady water content, so that it doesn't get too dry. And they may be close to their temperature tolerances in Curacao. So they can't get very much warmer than 30. Maybe a little more than that, but not a lot more. 30, 34, I think they don't like it.
Do the worms have like predators, like something that preys on them that we can maybe visually see and realize that maybe your worms are being preyed upon?
Yeah, there are some, there are many things like, rats will eat them, birds will eat them, some lizards will certainly eat them. So you would need to protect them from predators. There are smaller predators that are like centipedes, but they're usually not so many that they would reduce your earthworm population.
I've seen ants. They see ants eating them too.
Yeah, ants, sure. Ants will get in and try to catch them.
But the ants can only do something when the condition is dry, when they are dried up. When they are slimy, the ants can.
Yeah. Another key factor there is that the material is not too wet, because oxygen doesn't penetrate very well into soil, especially when it's wet. And at tropical temperatures, water doesn't hold a lot of oxygen, and yet earthworms are always breathing. They get oxygen by way of their skin when the skin has a thin layer of water on it. When they're wet, they would feel wet, and that's their good condition. So, but that at 30, 32 Celsius, the amount of oxygen dissolved in water is much lower than it is in a cold place. So they need it well aerated. It can't be a heavy packed down mass of organic matter. And that's for two reasons. One is the oxygen. The other is you don't want it to become a thermo-composting system. The earthworms will leave. They will go away from that high temperature. But when it's kept aerated and not too rich in things with a lot of nitrogen and nutrients in them, then the composting won't be so rapid, and the earthworms can keep up. So typically, earthworm composting, you give them small amounts of material spread out every day. They eat through that, you add more, and then more, and then more. And they create a layer of composted material that builds from the bottom. And the earthworms will be in the upper levels, feeding on the recently added material. But that's, that's a whole other topic of how to manage earthworm composting. But it sounds like there's some people there who have done this, or they know people who have done this.
And one of the students is actually building a vermicompost bin right now.
Great, good. I hope you find a good way to make it work. There's 2 or 3 other kinds of earthworms, one from India, one from Africa, that are quite good also. The one from Africa is a little easier to manage. The one from India can be very particular about the exact conditions. And if it doesn't like it, it will leave. They will start crawling out, and they will be everywhere. And there will be a big party by the lizards and the ants, and then you will have no worms.
So are we throwing those worms in the pile of what? We're throwing worms inside those and the compost.
Oh,
Is that the intention?
you could. So the question is, are we going to add worms to the compost pile we're doing? Right now, no, because it's generating too much heat.
Yeah.
You don't want to put your hand in there, let alone live in there. So it's tempting. But some people do, if you're patient, they'll do composting like that and then set the pile aside and put worms into it. And that really doubles down on the fertility of the pile. Because then you need to let it sit for several months while they just live and work. But you're taking something that is incredibly nutrient dense, bacterial, fungal dense, letting it mature even further. Fungi grows more. The worms do their work on already, they're eating already fertile stuff and pooping out even more fertile stuff. It's like what goes in influences what comes out. You are what you eat.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Human body temperature will kill just about any earthworm that we could ever be using in composting. So if you just think of it, it has to be cooler than that. So once that thermal phase is over, then you can add the composting earthworms to it, and they will like it very much. It's a very effective way to pre-treat things like animal manures, large animals, cattle manures, horse manure, things like that. To let it go through the thermal stage first and then give it to the earthworms. And as Chris was mentioning, it does greatly enhance the fertility. But there is something more to earthworm compost than simply the fertility. There are secretions by the earthworms or by the bacteria that they promote that have a very strong effect on plant health and growth. It may be helping to wake up the potential of the soil. I don't really know the details, but all we know is that it's soluble in water and it really works. So be interested to know how that earthworm composting project proceeds. And you have to be careful and watch it and make sure it's not too wet, not too dry, and it doesn't heat up. And apart from that, it should work.
Yeah, we've got a couple people that are interested in it, so we'll keep an eye on it as we go. So.
Right, and as it works also on, it reduces disease or pathogenic bacteria in manures generally, even human. It can be a strong treatment technique for the solids that come out of wastewater treatment, so the so-called sludge or biosolids. With the processing that through earthworm composting, you can get a nearly complete elimination of disease-causing bacteria that would be of concern to human health.
All right.
Anyway,
Last question.
Can you make
something else. Last question. Right.
extract from the casting of the worms to add on to the water that you're giving?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, you can make an extract, just dilute castings into water, and that's, you're getting a lot of water soluble nutrients out of it. I think if you really wanted to get the maximum out of it, it would be making tea, like feeding it. Because like half of what Sam's talking about is the real magic comes from the life that the earthworms encourage. So if we could make a compost tea, that would be incredible. The leachate that comes out of worm bins is water soluble nutrients. That's all it is. It's insanely nutrient rich. So if you added that to a compost tea we're making, I mean, that would go a long way to making that tea incredible. Not to mention if you were extracting bacteria and fungi from the castings from a good compost, adding different feeds, not just molasses, but all kinds of different things. And you could make incredible tea out of that stuff.
Yeah, it really works. I've heard some miracle stories about this. I've done a couple of my own, and I've seen that not just the tea works, the compost itself, but it only has to be in small quantities. 5 to 20% maximum of a soil mixture. Say if you're doing container growing or starting young plants for transplanting out, just that much, 15 to 20% substitution into the soil mix of compost, earthworm compost, does really good things. I was at a conference where one man present, this was in the Philippines, was telling me about a farm he bought that had a really big mango tree on it. And he looked at the mango tree and he didn't see any fruit, maybe 2 or 3 fruits. But the people who worked on the farm it would always be sitting under the tree, eating lunch and resting and doing some work there because it was such good shade. So so what about this tree? Does it ever make fruit? And they said, oh, no, it used to, when so-and-so over there was a very young man, he said it used to make a lot of fruit, but now it doesn't. So this guy started earthworm composting, and he had a lot of compost, and it was a big tree. So, but he didn't have that much, and he didn't want to use it all on this tree. So he started by going around the, what do you call the drip line of the tree, the outermost circle that the tree makes. And he started putting compost on, he decided, I'll do 25%, a quarter of the circle every time I can. So he would do this. So he put down a quarter, and then several months, half a year later, he put down another quarter. And then he's getting ready to put on the next quarter, and he looks up at the tree is covered with flowers. That half that already got compost has flowers all over it. And then he puts on more, and then he completes the circle. So it's taken him maybe 2 years to get full circle on this tree with the compost. By that point, the whole tree is flowering, making fruits. He said they have to prop the tree up. They were thinking, oh, well, let's cut it down because it's not making any fruit. Now they're putting wood under the branches to hold the branches up. So this was just one old tree. It was just on abused soil, and just doing that was enough. And, now the guys can still sleep under it. They can eat lunch, and now they can have mangoes too. So when I heard that, I went home, and my wife told me that this one flowering plant in the house had already flowered, but didn't do very much. So the next day, some guy asked me to identify the earthworms in his compost, and then he gave me some compost. And I took that home, and I put a big handful of that on the plant that hadn't flowered very well. and it started to flower. 2-3 weeks later, it started to flower. It should have been done for the year, but it started. So, I've really seen it do things that are very impressive. It's not the only answer. It's just part of a whole system, but it is definitely something that if it's something you can manage and try it out, see what happens. I think it could be beneficial. Especially it promotes disease resistance as well.
All right, it's about that time.
It is about that time. Okay.
So try to get to the readings for next Wednesday. I sent the pages in the WhatsApp group. The book is available online. Get through that. This Thursday, Alvin's coming. Everybody here knows who Alvin is. One of the organizers of the course coming in. Him and I, want to check in with you guys and see how it's going. So, not just the content, but also the scheduling. It seems like people can kind of make it to the academic stuff, but the workshops are tougher. Some people are late. Some people come when they can. Life's going on. So we want to talk to you guys and see what's going on, because they're investing a lot in this class, and they want you guys to be getting the most out of it. So, and same for us. This is a different experience for us. We're teaching adults with lives rather than college students who it's their job to be students. So we're trying to learn and adjust how best to suit that as well. So Thursday, the only thing we're going to do is sit down and talk about how the class is going, what's going on, what's good, what's bad. It's up here. It's this Thursday. So that is the 5th. So Sam will be finishing up on Wednesday. And then Thursday will be devoted to review and checking in on the class. You want to hear how it goes.
All right. So we'll see how those.
Yeah. So tomorrow we'll be here at LVV. I'd like to put down some plastic to start smothering some of the beds we want to plant into. I want to start a compost pile here. So we need to gather some supplies, some green material from the back of LVV here. Get everything together, but there's not time to build the pile in the morning. We'll build it in the afternoon, more than likely. Maybe we'll get into seeding. I talked a little bit about some soil mixes a week ago or so, but we could get into seeding a few things, talking about seeding processes, just doing it a little bit. So if you're coming tomorrow, we're here probably the whole day. All right. Hi guys.
All right. Good night. See you in a couple of days.
Righty.